Pretend to be my father, please, the girl begged. The words were a ghost on the wind, swallowed by the Montana heat. Under a sun that baked the world into a cracked earth puzzle, an 8-year-old girl named Lydia Vance was about to be erased. She was a stray, a problem, and the sound of approaching horses was the sound of the world coming to solve her. A column of cavalry shimmered in the distance, led by a man who looked like he was carved from stone and duty, Colonel Alistair Finch. He was the law, and the law had no room for little girls lost in the dust without a name to claim them. Panic, cold and sharp, seized Lydia's heart. Her eyes darted around the empty plains, searching for an escape, for any shield against the coming storm. And then she saw him. He was Apache, a warrior who seemed to rise from the dirt itself, his face a roadmap of sun and sorrow. He stood alone, a silent witness to a world that had stolen everything from him. His people were gone, his family just whispers in his memory. He was a ghost haunting his own land. In a final desperate gamble, Lydia ran. Her small feet kicked up puffs of dust, a frantic drumbeat against the rhythmic thunder of the cavalry. She reached the warrior, her plea a raw, urgent whisper. Pretend to be my father. In her pocket, her fingers closed around a small, smooth wooden bird, its wings half spread. It was a secret she didn't understand, a heavy piece of a life that had vanished in a cloud of shouting and fear just days before. The warrior Hakan didn't move. His world was one of silence, a silence imposed by grief. Helping this child, a daughter of the very people who had burned his world to ash, felt like a betrayal, a desecration of the spirits he carried in his heart. But then he looked down. He looked into her eyes, wide with a terror that was older than her years, and he didn't see the daughter of his enemy. He saw the ghost of his own little girl, the one the spirits had called home too soon. He heard the faint echo of a laugh he thought was buried forever. The cavalry ground to a halt. Leather creaked. Harnesses jingled. Colonel Finch's shadow fell over them like a verdict. His eyes, sharp and calculating, took in the scene, the stoic warrior and the terrified child. He was a man who saw deception in every shadow of this wild land, and his mind was already drawing a conclusion. But before the first question could be asked, before the world could slam its iron door shut, Hakan made his choice. He said nothing. He didn't need to. He simply reached down and rested a large, steady hand on Lydia's small shoulder. It wasn't just a touch. It was a claim, an anchor, a silent lie that bound a man who had lost everything to a child who had nothing. It was a lie that would either save them both or drag them both down into the dust. The weight of Hakan's hand on Lydia's shoulder was a fortress built in a single heartbeat. Colonel Finch's eyes, the color of a winter sky, narrowed. The world in his mind was a ledger of rules and violations, and this entry didn't add up. An Apache warrior, a relic of a conquered people, standing protector over a fair-haired settlement child. It was a crack in the foundation of the order he was sworn to uphold. He swung down from his horse, the creak of his saddle as loud as a judge's gavel. He ignored Hakan. In his world, men like Hakan were part of the landscape, not part of the conversation. His focus was entirely on the girl. His voice was dry leather and authority. "What's your name, child? Where is your mother? Who is this man to you?" The questions were stones thrown at her. Lydia flinched, burying her face into the worn buckskin of Hakan's leg, her small hands gripping the material like it was the only solid thing in the universe. She was drowning, and he was her unlikely shore. Seeing he'd get no answers from the girl, Finch's gaze finally reluctantly settled on Hakan. It was a look of profound suspicion, an assessment of a threat. Hakan met it without emotion, his face a mask, but his eyes held the resolve of a mountain that had endured 1,000 storms. He would not speak the white man's tongue. He would not give the colonel the satisfaction. His stillness was his answer. The hand on Lydia's shoulder didn't tremble. It was an anchor in an unmoored world. Frustration flickered across the colonel's face. He was a man of commands and responses, and this silent defiance was a language he couldn't parse. He gestured east, his frustration finding an outlet in a report of his duty. He spoke more to his men than to them, of fugitives he was tracking, remnants of a gold dispute that had turned bloody. He described a man and a woman, a wagon found abandoned, rumors of a betrayal that ended in gunfire. As the colonel's words filled the air, Hakan felt a tremor run through the small body pressed against him. It was the vibration of a memory too terrible to be spoken. Her grip on his leg tightened with a pain that went far beyond simple fear. Hakan didn't understand the words, but he understood her pain. He knew now. Her abandonment wasn't an accident. It was the violent aftermath of a storm, and she was the last leaf clinging to a branch. The colonel, oblivious, made his decision. Unconvinced, but without cause to separate them, he declared they would be escorted to the nearest settlement, a hopeful speck on the map called Harmony Creek. There the circuit judge could make a formal inquiry. It was presented as procedure, but it felt like a sentence. They were prisoners of the lie. The cavalry column shifted, reforming around them. The patch of dusty earth where a desperate plea had been answered was now behind them. Ahead lay a forced journey under the watchful eyes of armed men. They were an anomaly being absorbed into the machinery of the law, a puzzle to be solved and filed away. As they began to move, Hakan looked down at the top of Lydia's head. He could smell the sun in her hair. He was a man who had walked with ghosts for so long, he had forgotten the feeling of a living responsibility. The spirits of his wife and daughter whispered on the wind, but the trembling of the child beside him was a more urgent song. A shift occurred within him on that dusty trail. The gray world of his own grief began to recede, replaced by a singular, focused purpose. He had stepped out of his own story and into hers. The lie he had accepted was no longer just a shield. It was a seed. And on this long road, under the suspicious gaze of his sworn enemies, it was his duty to see that it grew into a sanctuary. He understood with the clarity of a lightning strike that his journey was no longer a solitary walk toward the end. The long road to Harmony Creek was a solemn vow that he now had to keep no matter the cost. Harmony Creek was a name born of hope, not reality. It was a raw gash of civilization carved into the wilderness, a handful of wooden buildings huddled together against the vast, indifferent landscape. As the cavalry escorted Hakan and Lydia down its single dusty main street, the town seemed to hold its breath. Doors that had been open were quietly closed. The rhythmic clang of the blacksmith's hammer fell silent. Faces appeared in windows, pale and curious, their gazes a mixture of fear and morbid fascination. Hakan was a phantom from the wild, the living embodiment of the stories they told their children to make them behave. And Lydia, clinging to him, was an aberration, a violation of the natural order. Colonel Finch halted in front of the sheriff's office. He dismounted and spoke in low, official tones to a paunchy man with a tarnished star. Words like circuit judge and remain within town limits drifted on the dry air. Hakan and Lydia were delivered like a parcel of uncertain contents. With a final, lingering look of suspicion, the colonel mounted his horse and the cavalry moved on, their departure as swift as their arrival. The law had delivered them, and now the law was leaving them to the mercy of a far more unpredictable jury. Public opinion. The silence they left behind was heavy and hostile. Townspeople began to emerge, their whispers like the rustling of dry leaves. Hakan stood perfectly still, his body a shield for the girl who hid behind him. He surveyed their faces, reading the open contempt. This was a different kind of wilderness. Its dangers weren't claw or fang, but the sharp edges of prejudice. From the shaded porch of the general store, a woman named Ara watched. She was a widow, a woman who had learned the hard lessons of survival from the land itself. Where others saw a savage, she saw a man standing as tall as a great pine against a storm. Where they saw a sullied child, she saw a sapling finding shelter in that tree's shadow. As she watched, her eyes caught a small detail. A pattern of blue and white beads stitched into the cuff of Hakan's worn leggings. It was a specific geometric design, a small river of color against the weathered brown. Her breath caught in her throat. She had seen that pattern only once before, years ago, on a deerskin pouch that belonged to her late husband, a trapper. It was a gift, he had told her, from a people who understood the balance of the world. That small, forgotten detail was a bridge across the chasm of fear. Making a decision that caused a collective gasp to ripple through the onlookers, Ara stepped off her porch and walked calmly toward the lone warrior and the child. She stopped a respectful distance away, her eyes meeting Hawkins. He saw no fear in her gaze, only a quiet, assessing strength. She spoke, her voice clear and steady. She told them they could not stay in the street. She offered them the shelter of her barn for the night. The offer hung in the air, an act of such profound defiance against the town's unspoken verdict that it felt like a gunshot. A man from the crowd shouted, questioning her sanity. Ara didn't waver. She turned her head slightly. A thirsty man is a danger to himself. A desperate man is a danger to everyone. She looked back at Hakan, her offer now becoming a challenge, a contract. The barn is yours for the night. The girl needs a roof, but this town has no heart for charity. She pointed toward the well that stood beside her store. My pump is broken. The chain snapped deep below, and the bucket is lost in the dark. The blacksmith says it's a job for a new rope and a fool. Her eyes locked onto his. You look like neither. If there is water in my bucket by sunrise, you will have earned your bread and board. If it remains empty, you must both be gone with the morning mist. The barn was a world of shadows and whispers, the scent of dry hay and old leather, a comforting world away from the hostility of the street. For Lydia, curled in a nest of straw Håkon had made, it was the first moment of something resembling peace. She watched him, a silent, powerful figure moving in the gloom. He didn't speak, but his presence was a language all its own, a constant reassurance. Sleep eventually took her, fitful and haunted by fragmented memories of shouting and dust. Håkon did not rest. He sat in the open doorway, a sentinel watching the unfamiliar stars over the sleeping town. He was a man of the open plains, and these walls felt like a cage. He thought about the well. To him, it was a clumsy attempt by the settlers to tame the deep, hidden rivers of the earth. But the challenge wasn't about the machine. It was a test of survival in this new, hostile territory. As the first pale light of dawn began to erase the stars, Håkon rose. He moved with quiet grace to the well. As if summoned, a small crowd began to gather, their faces etched with skepticism and a grim hope that he would fail. The blacksmith was there, his thick arms crossed, a smug look on his face. This was his domain of iron and mechanics, and he was certain the savage would be lost. Håkon ignored them. He knelt beside the well, not as a mechanic, but as a tracker reading a trail. He didn't see a broken machine. He saw a system out of balance. He ran his calloused fingers over the wooden housing, feeling for things the blacksmith, with his eyes trained only on metal, had missed. He listened to the echo of a stone he dropped into the darkness, gauging the depth not in feet and inches, but in the time it took for the sound to return. He found the problem. It wasn't just the snapped chain. The relentless sun had warped the wooden frame of the pulley housing, creating a subtle, unnatural friction. The chain hadn't just broken from use, it had been slowly, insistently worn away. It was a detail born of the environment, something only a man who understood the language of wood and weather would recognize. He worked with a deliberate, unhurried focus. He used a strip of leather from his own gear, soaking it and carefully wedging it into the warped frame, knowing that as it dried, it would expand and then contract, gently coaxing the wood back into alignment. To retrieve the lost bucket, he didn't use hooks. He fashioned a weighted loop from old rope, using a complex knot taught to him as a boy, a knot designed to tighten under strain from any direction. It was the kind of knowledge a man whose life depended on the strength of a snare would possess. The crowd watched in confused silence. His methods were alien, quiet, thoughtful, and utterly devoid of the brute force they expected. Then came the sound. Not the groan of stressed metal, but the clean, rhythmic clanking of a chain moving freely, followed by the beautiful, life-affirming splash of a full bucket being drawn into the morning air. Håkon worked the handle, and a moment later, a bucket brimming with clear, cold water rested on the edge of the well. A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. Ara walked forward and looked into the bucket. She then looked at Håkon, her expression not one of assessment, but of genuine respect. She gave a single, firm nod. The pack was sealed. The blacksmith, his face a mask of grudging admiration, stepped forward to inspect the work, shaking his head in wonder. For the first time, the stares directed at Håkon were not of fear, but of reluctant awe. He hadn't just earned his keep. He had demonstrated a wisdom their world of iron and hammers couldn't comprehend. Later that morning in the shade behind the store, Ara gave them fresh bread and cheese. As Lydia ate, a real smile touched her lips, and the sight of it did more to heal Hakan's soul than any medicine. For a fleeting moment, there was peace, a fragile, tentative peace, and then it shattered. A lone rider entered town, moving with the coiled stillness of a rattlesnake. He was dressed in black, his face shadowed by a dusty hat. He carried himself with the dangerous confidence of a man who takes what he wants. His eyes, chips of obsidian, swept over the town with a predator's casual assessment. Then they stopped. They fixed upon Lydia as she took a bite of bread. A slow, cold smile of recognition spread across his face, a smile that promised old debts were about to be collected. It was a look of discovery and of ownership. Hakan felt the change in the air before he saw the man. A sudden chill, a primal warning. He followed the stranger's gaze and saw it resting on the child. In that instant, Hakan understood. The trial of the well had been a simple test of skill. This was a trial of a different kind, one that had followed them from the wilderness and now stood smiling in the heart of town. A specter of violence that threatened to devour the little peace they had fought so hard to win. The arrival of Corbin Malloy draped a shroud of unseen tension over Harmony Creek. He didn't act. He simply existed. A shadow in the corner of the saloon, a still figure on a porch, his eyes always watching. The townspeople felt it as a prickle on the back of their necks. For Hakan, it was a constant state of alert, a return to a warrior's mindset. He was Lydia's living shield, his presence a silent promise of violence to the man who watched her with a predator's patience. Two hunters were now in Harmony Creek, one hunting for a piece of his past, a debt he believed was owed in blood, the other hunting for the safety of a future he was only just beginning to imagine, for the ghost of a daughter he had found again in the eyes of a lost child. The turning point came with the cry of fire. The night erupted. The livery stable, a tinder box of dry wood and hay, was consumed by a hungry orange beast. Flames roared into the sky, painting the smoke clouds with a hellish light. Panic was the first contagion. Men spilled out of the saloon, shouting, disorganized, forming a chaotic bucket brigade that was useless. The fire was winning, and the wind, fickle and cruel, was pushing embers toward the heart of the town, towards Ara's general store. In the midst of the chaos, Hakan was an island of calm. He saw not a random disaster, but an opponent with tactics and weaknesses. While others fought the flames head-on, he moved with a chilling purpose, reading the wind, assessing the fuel. He didn't shout orders. He moved, and his purpose was so clear, so undeniable, that men turned from their panicked efforts to follow him. He pointed to a small woodshed between the stable and the store, and with a shared understanding, they tore it down, creating a desperate firebreak. He grabbed blankets from Ara's store, had them soaked, and directed men to drape them over her roof, a shield against the falling sparks. He was not one of them, but in that moment, he was their only hope. A silent commander in a battle they were losing. He needed more water, faster. The stable's own pump was near the back, dangerously close to the collapsing wall of flame. As he moved through the choking smoke and blistering heat, his eyes scanning the ground, he saw it. There, in the dirt, half buried in the chaos and illuminated by the ghastly light, was a small object. He stooped and picked it up. A wooden bird, its wings half spread, its surface slightly scorched. He knew its smooth carved lines intimately. He had watched Lydia's small fingers trace those same lines on an identical bird she kept hidden in her pocket. The truth struck him with the force of a physical blow. This was no accident. Malloy had set this fire. It was a diversion, a tool to create chaos, a screen of smoke behind which he could steal the child. It was a message and a trap. A cold, clarifying rage settled over Hakan. He was no longer just saving a town. He was defending a life. With a renewed, ferocious energy, he rallied the men, pushing them to work with a focus they didn't know they possessed. He fought the fire not with rage, but with a cold, strategic fury. Slowly, impossibly, they began to turn the tide. The beast of flame was being starved, choked, and beaten back. As the last of the great flames died down to angry, glowing embers, leaving the smoldering skeleton of the stable against the dawn sky. A new kind of silence fell, a silence of exhaustion, of shock, and of a dawning shared gratitude. The townspeople looked at Håkon, no longer with suspicion, but with a profound, bewildered respect. The blacksmith, his face smudged with soot, met Håkon's eyes and gave a slow, deliberate nod. It was an apology and a salute in one, but the true reckoning of the night was yet to come. Ara rushed to Lydia, who was huddled on the porch, her face pale with terror. For comfort, the girl had pulled her own small bird from her pocket and was clutching it in her hand. Håkon approached them, his face grim, and opened his palm, revealing the charred twin he had found in the dirt. Ara's eyes darted from the bird in Lydia's hand to the one in Håkon's. The color drained from her face as the pieces of the puzzle clicked into place with horrifying speed. The stranger, the fire, the identical tokens. This was not a random girl who had been abandoned. This was a child who was being hunted. Her gaze lifted to meet Håkon's. Her fear for her town replaced by a deeper, more personal fear for the girl and the man who protected her. Her voice was a barely audible whisper, a question that forged their fates together in a way the fire never could. Who were they? She asked, her eyes locked on his. The people who made these. Who is she running from? In the light of the new day, Harmony Creek was a town of shared purpose, united by the communal wound of the fire. The smoldering ruins of the livery stable stood as a stark reminder of how close they had all come to ruin. As men worked to clear the debris, a profound shift had occurred. When Håkon emerged to help, no one turned away. Instead, a man silently offered him a canteen of water. The blacksmith left a plate of biscuits and bacon on a crate near where Håkon was working. They were small gestures, but in the silent language of the West, they were volumes of acknowledgement. He was no longer just the savage. He was the man who had stood with them against the flames. Ara, seeing the exhaustion in both his and Lydia's eyes, would not hear of them returning to the barn. She made up a small cot for Lydia in a storage room behind the store, a quiet, safe space that smelled of cinnamon and dried herbs. For Håkon, she offered a bedroll by the hearth of her own small living quarters. It was a home that smelled of baked bread and lavender, a universe away from the life of dust and open skies he had known. He had not slept under a permanent roof in years. In the sheer domesticity of it, the tick of a clock, the soft glow of a lamp, was both comforting and deeply unsettling. A fragile peace settled upon them. It was a time of quiet healing, of bonds being forged not in the heat of crisis, but in the gentle rhythm of daily life. Håkon would watch as Ara taught Lydia to braid her own hair, his stoic expression softening. He, in turn, showed the girl how to read the clouds, to know when rain was coming, how to carve a simple whistle from a river reed. They were building a family with the scattered pieces of their broken lives. One night, a choked cry from the back room startled them. Lydia was in the grip of a nightmare, her small body trembling, whimpering about smoke and a man with dark eyes. Håkon was there in an instant. He didn't wake her. He simply sat on the floor beside her cot, his presence a steady, unshakable mountain. He began to hum, a low, guttural melody from a time before words, a song of the earth and the sky. The ancient sound filled the small room, a lullaby of profound sorrow and strength. Slowly the girl's trembling ceased, and she sank back into a peaceful sleep. Era stood in the doorway, a silent witness to this act of profound fatherhood, her heart aching. Later that evening, as Lydia slept, Era finally acted on the curiosity that had been burning within her. She brought out the old deerskin pouch her husband had left her. She showed Håkon the familiar pattern of beads. Then she tipped its contents into her palm, a single smooth gray stone painted with a blue symbol of a winding river. She asked Håkon what it meant. For a long moment he was silent. Then in a low, rough voice, he spoke the name of his people, a name that had not passed his lips in years. The Winter River people. Era told him the story her husband had shared of helping a lost and starving band of Apache find a hidden valley to survive a brutal winter. A winter when the cavalry had been relentless. Håkon's eyes looked distant. She saw the recognition, the sudden, painful light of a memory he had thought long buried. He had been a boy, huddled under a buffalo robe, watching a tall, pale-eyed stranger lead his father and the other warriors to safety. A few seasons later, the soldiers had returned, and this time, there was no one to help them. A circle had been closed. The kindness of Ara's husband, offered to a dying people years ago, was now being repaid by his widow to one of its last survivors, and the child he had claimed. The peace felt real, almost permanent. Lydia had even started to laugh, a sound as precious as spring rain. But the West does not allow for long seasons of peace. The calm was shattered by the thunder of hooves. A rider, his face a mask of panic, galloped into town, shouting about the creek. He reined his horse to a rearing halt, gasping for breath, talking of dead cattle downstream, their bodies bloated in the shallows. The sheriff, followed by a grim-faced posse that now included the blacksmith, rode out. They returned hours later as the sun was setting, their faces dark with a renewed and terrible suspicion. The sheriff dismounted, walked to the center of the street, and held up a piece of paper that had been pinned to a tree with a hunting knife. His voice was cold, all the fragile trust of the past days gone, burned away by a new fear. He read the note aloud. The words were crude, a venomous poison aimed directly at the heart of their newfound unity. It spoke of the water being tainted, a curse brought upon them by the savage in their midst, an act of revenge for stolen land. Every eye in that street, eyes that had looked at Hakan with respect only that morning, now turned on him, filled with the old familiar hatred, resurrected in an instant. The gratitude of Harmony Creek had been a fragile skin of ice over a deep, cold lake of fear, and Malloy's lie was the heavy stone that had just shattered it. The faces that had offered Hakan bread now contorted with renewed suspicion and rage. They were a crowd on the verge of becoming a mob, their fear seeking a simple, immediate target. Hakan stood before them, unmovable. Lydia was a small, terrified presence behind him. At his side, her own fear a palpable thing, stood Ara, her shotgun held loosely but purposefully in her hands. She stood between her friend and her town, a lone bastion of reason. The sheriff, a man caught between the law and the mob rule, threatening to swallow his town, stepped forward. He told Hakan he had to be locked up for his own safety. Hakan gave a slow, deliberate shake of his head. His eyes, dark and intense, were fixed on the sheriff, but his message was for everyone. He would not be caged. He would not be separated from the girl. To do so would be to hand her directly to the shadow that was poisoning this town. He was no longer a stranger seeking shelter. He was a father defending his territory. He then did something they did not expect. He spoke, his voice low and raspy from disuse, but clear. He told them he would find the truth. He would follow the creek and read the story it had to tell. It was not a plea, it was a declaration. Era seized the moment, arguing that a man in a cell could prove nothing. She put her faith in him on the line for all to see. The sheriff, looking at the angry faces and then at the warrior's unshakable resolve, reluctantly agreed. He deputized 3 men, including the blacksmith, to accompany Hakan. They were not there to help. They were there as guards. The journey up the creek was a tense, silent affair. Where the townsmen saw only mud and rocks, Hakan saw a story written on the land. He pointed to tracks that showed a heavy load being dragged, to branches broken in a way no animal would break them. His escorts followed, their suspicion warring with a grudging respect for his skill. A few miles upstream they found it. Not poison, but a deception born of malice. The creek had been crudely dammed, and the rotting carcasses of 2 coyotes had been thrown into the stagnant, foul-smelling pool behind it. It was a lie designed to prey on their deepest fears. As the others reacted with anger, Hakan's eyes were still scanning, reading the final chapter of the story. He found Malloy's boot prints, as expected. But then he saw a second set, heavier, wider. The tracks of a townsman, and then half hidden under a bush, he found the source of the evil. A small, mundane object, a half-smoked, chewed cigar, the cheap brand the blacksmith favored. Hakan picked it up. He turned and looked directly at the blacksmith. The big man's face, already flushed, went pale as death. Their eyes met, and in that silent, terrible moment, the blacksmith's guilt was as clear as a signed confession. Hakan now held the truth in his hand. But as he opened his mouth to expose the traitor, a faint sound carried on the wind from downriver. A single sharp cry, followed by another. A signal. A cold dread washed over Hakan, more terrifying than the mob or the lie. He understood the full, horrifying complexity of Malloy's plan. The poisoned creek, the note, the investigation. It was all a masterful diversion, a strategy to draw him, the sheriff, and the strongest men out of town, leaving it defenseless, leaving Lydia protected only by Era. The real attack was happening now. In that heartbeat, justice ceased to matter. Vengeance was a luxury. Clearing his name was a ghost. There was only Lydia. His choice was instantaneous, absolute, and sacrificial. He met the blacksmith's terrified gaze one last time, a look of cold contempt passing between them. Then deliberately he unclenched his fingers and let the cigar, the proof of his innocence, fall into the tainted water. He was letting the traitor go, sacrificing the truth to buy himself seconds. He turned his back on the confused men, on his own exoneration, and he ran. He abandoned the measured pace of the tracker and unleashed the desperate, lung-searing sprint of a father. He crashed through the underbrush, his feet pounding the earth, his mind fixed on a single image. A little girl with trusting eyes, alone in a town where a monster had just been set loose. He burst back into Harmony Creek, not as a man, but as a force of nature, a blur of desperate, protective instinct. The town was eerily silent. The men who should have been its guardians were still miles up the creek, chasing a lie. He found them in the general store. The scene was one of quiet, predatory terror. Corbin Malloy was not a man of swift violence, but of cruel enjoyment. He had Ara and Lydia backed against the far counter, not harming them, but savoring their fear. He was a cat with two cornered mice. His voice was a low poison as he spoke of what happens to the children of traitors. At the sight of Hakan in the doorway, a slow, cruel smile spread across Malloy's face. This was the moment he had engineered. Hakan, with his primitive knife, against him, a man armed with a revolver and a heart full of malice. The fight was brutal and immediate. Malloy was larger, stronger, fueled by a swaggering confidence. He fired his pistol, the shot deafening in the enclosed space, splintering the doorframe where Hakan's head had been a second before. But Hakan wasn't a brawler. He was a hunter. He used the store itself as his weapon. He moved with fluid grace, tipping a barrel of salted fish to send Malloy slipping, kicking over a crate of tin cans to create a rattling, uncertain terrain. In a swift movement, he sliced a rope holding sacks of flour on a high shelf, and the room exploded in a cloud of white, choking dust. For a few precious seconds, the predator was blind. But Malloy was a survivor. He came charging out of the white haze, swinging wildly, catching Hakan with a blow that sent him staggering back against a shelf of preserved goods. Jars of peaches and pickles rained down, shattering on the floor. Malloy loomed over him, his face a mask of triumph, raising his pistol to use as a club for the final crushing blow. In that moment of certain doom, help came from the most unexpected of sources. The heavy double doors of the general store burst open. It was the blacksmith. His face was a canvas of sweat, shame, and a terrible newfound resolve. He had outrun the others, his guilt a powerful spur. He saw Malloy standing over the man who had just protected his secret. He saw the evil he had enabled about to triumph. Without a word, he did the only thing a blacksmith can do. With a guttural roar, he threw his heavy smithing hammer. It spun end over end through the air, not a weapon of death, but of justice, and struck Malloy's gun hand with a sickening crunch of bone. The pistol clattered to the floor. Malloy howled, more in shock and betrayal than in pain. His own pawn had turned against him. That was all the opening Hakan needed. He surged upward, not with a warrior's fury, but with a father's righteous rage. The fight ended swiftly after that. Just as Hakan subdued him, the sheriff and the other men came running, their faces a mixture of confusion and dawning understanding. They saw Hakan not as a menace, but as a protector. They saw the blacksmith, his stance a silent confession. And they saw Malloy, the true source of the poison, finally brought to heel. As the sheriff hauled the defeated outlaw to his feet, Malloy, in a final desperate act of spite, spat out the truth he thought would be his ultimate weapon. "You're all fool," he screamed, his voice raw with hatred. "He's not even her father. She's the whelp of traitors who betrayed my gang, and he's just some savage who found her by the trail." The ugly words echoed in the sudden silence. The townspeople stared, the revelation shocking them. At that exact moment, another sound filled the street, the rhythmic tread of approaching cavalry. Colonel Alistair Finch rode into the scene, his patrol drawn by the sound of the gunshot. He took in the entire tableau with a single sweeping gaze. The subdued outlaw, the heroic warrior, the protected child, and the ashamed, silent town. His face was unreadable. The threat was over. But as the sheriff began to lead Malloy toward the jail cell, Malloy twisted his head and fixed his venomous glare on the blacksmith. "You'll pay for this," he hissed, his voice low and chilling. "My friends, don't forget traitors. This isn't over." The words hung in the air, a cold promise that while this battle had been won, the war for Lydia's safety was far from over. All eyes in Harmony Creek turned to Colonel Alistair Finch. He was the law, the ultimate authority, and he now stood as the sole arbiter of a fate forged in desperation and sealed in conflict. Before him stood a scene that defied every regulation in his books. A warrior of a defeated people, a lost child of settlers, and a town that had, in the crucible of fire and fear, chosen its own kind of justice. Malloy's final, spiteful words still hung in the air, a truth intended to be a weapon. The colonel dismounted, his movements deliberate. He looked at Malloy, held in the sheriff's grip, with a look of pure contempt. Then his gaze softened as he looked at Lydia, who instinctively pressed closer to Hakan. Finally, his eyes rested on the Apache warrior. He saw not a savage, but a man who stood as a guardian, his weariness outshone by a fierce, protective light. The colonel was a man who lived by rules, but he was also a man who had witnessed something that transcended them. He had seen a lie born of desperation become a vow of protection. He had seen a man with nothing left to lose sacrifice everything for a child who was not his own. "The law recognizes blood," the colonel stated, his voice carrying across the silent street. "But out here we learn that the wilderness recognizes something older, something truer. It recognizes sacrifice." He paused, his gaze sweeping over the townspeople who had, just an hour before, been ready to condemn Hakan. "I have seen no greater act of fatherhood than what I have witnessed here. By the authority vested in me by the United States Army and the territorial governor, I am legitimizing this union. Hakan is to be considered the girl's legal guardian until the circuit judge can make it official." A collective breath was released. The law had not broken them apart. It had bound them together. Spring came to Montana, not just as a season, but as a promise kept. The harsh winds gave way to gentle breezes, and the land, scarred by a brutal winter, bloomed with defiant life. Harmony Creek healed and grew, the shared memory of the fire forging a stronger community. The livery stable was rebuilt, better than before, by the hands of all the townsmen, the blacksmith, and Hakan, working side by side in a quiet, shared understanding. Their new life settled into a gentle rhythm. Hakan was no longer an outsider. He was a respected part of the town, his skills as a tracker and his wisdom of the land sought after. He taught the ranchers' sons how to read the signs of a coming storm and how to find water where none seemed to exist. Lydia was, for the first time, simply a child. Her laughter was a frequent sound, no longer a rare and precious thing. She attended the small school, and in the afternoons she would sit on the porch of the general store, a store that had become a home. Hakan, Lydia, and Ara had become a family. Their bond lived every day in shared meals, quiet conversations, and the easy comfort of their presence. One afternoon, months later, a buggy rolled into town carrying a man in a fine but dusty suit. It was the circuit judge. A flicker of the old fear returned. The final seal of the law had arrived. The judge asked to speak with Hakan. The whole town watched as Hakan, with Lydia at his side and Ara standing with him, met the man on the porch. But the judge had not come to question or to challenge. He had heard the story, a story that was already becoming a legend in the territory. He spoke of the notorious Malloy Gang, a plague on the frontier, and how the capture of Corbin Malloy in Harmony Creek had led to the dismantling of their entire operation. The territorial government, he explained, wished to reward the hero responsible. He unrolled a map and presented Hakan with a legal deed. It was for 100 acres of fertile land just outside of town, along the very creek he had been accused of poisoning, a homestead in his name, and in the name of his daughter Lydia. In the profound silence that followed, the weight of the moment settled over Hakan. He, a son of a people from whom all land had been taken, was now being given a piece of it back. Not as a concession to a forgotten past, but as a reward for being a citizen, a protector, a father. He had not only found a home in the hearts of others, he had earned a home on the land itself. As the sun began to set, casting long golden shadows across the street, the three of them stood together, looking out at the hills where their future lay. In the vast and unforgiving canvas of the Old West, stories were often written in dust and blood. But on rare occasions, a story was written in courage and kindness. It was a story that proved that family is not always the blood you share, but the blood you are willing to shed for another. It proved that home is not a place you are given, but a sanctuary you build with your own two hands. And it proved that the deepest wounds can, with time and love, become the source of the greatest strength. Did you enjoy this journey? Tell us which part of the world you're watching this story from. Leave your comment, and to make sure you don't miss our next adventures, don't forget to subscribe.